But before anyone else, we've got an exclusive look at an inside page from The Sun and the front page as well of Metro. And it says this: Trump, the trial's beginning, of course. 34 raps, it says, the ex-president is facing. The trial is an assault on America, according to Donald Trump. Front page of the Metro as well, Trump's historic criminal trial. This is an outrage. Ex-president's fury as he appears in court. And, of course, he is back in the dock. He returned to a New York court this afternoon, accused of falsifying business records to cover up a hush money payment made to porn star Stormy Daniels. As the case opened in New York this afternoon, Mr. Trump once again slammed it as a witch hunt, which shouldn't be allowed to happen. It's one of 4 legal battles being faced by the man who is the current presidential election favourite. But it's already going wrong for the prosecution. Joining me now is Chairman of Republican Overseas UK. It is, of course, Greg Swenson. Greg, very good evening to you.
Good to be here, Mike.
Welcome to the Independent Republican, Mike Graham. I mean, Donald Trump remains box office wherever he goes, right? He arrives in his motorcade, there's crowds outside, there's people demonstrating, there's people imitating him, there's a couple of Trump impersonators. The case hasn't, as far as I understand it, really got going yet. We've had the judge telling him that he's not allowed to speak, that he's not allowed to miss any of the hearings, that if he does so, an arrest warrant may be issued for him. But they're still going through the process of trying to find some impartial jurors, I understand.
Yeah, good luck with that. It would be really difficult in New York.
Yeah.
You know, as you know, it's a really hostile jury pool in New York. 88% of the jury pool voted for Biden. But it's not just that they voted for Biden. They are rabid anti-Trumpers.
Right.
Trump derangement syndrome was born in Manhattan.
Yeah.
If this trial was in Staten Island, he would win.
He would be fine.
He'd be
well, this
fine.
is it. I was saying this last week when I went over to America just over Easter break, and I was in Manhattan very, very short time. But in Connecticut, which you wouldn't really regard as one of the great Republican states necessarily.
No.
Everywhere I went, there were Trump banners, there were Trump flags,
Sure.
there were Trump bumper stickers. I didn't see any for Biden.
Once you leave southwestern Connecticut, Fairfield County, where Greenwich and other uppity kind of lakefront liberal towns are, once you get out of there, it's a red state.
Yeah.
Same with Massachusetts and New York. Once you get out of the cities, the urban centers, and the sort of limousine liberal sections, which I would argue, Southwest or Fairfield County is. It's a red state. It's very pro-Trump.
Right.
And so I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, interesting. And what about the fact that it could be that they won't find a jury? Because, if you genuinely ask anyone, I would have thought, even the most sort of disenfranchised American, have you got a view of Donald Trump? You're going to have one, aren't you?
Right. Yeah. It's pretty obscene to have this trial in Manhattan. He will not get a fair trial. He will not have a jury of his peers. He's going to have a jury of people that hate him. Okay. So I think there's a good chance that he gets a conviction here, even though as on a legal basis, it's a complete sham. I mean, it's weak and untested legal premises.
Right.
It's the worst of all the 4 indictments, right? Which is good for Trump, that the worst case is coming first.
Yeah.
But he still could get a conviction because of the hostile jury pool.
But
it'll be overturned on appeal.
Well, yeah, but if in fact his lawyers are as good as I would imagine they are, they may say, well, it's impossible to actually field a jury at all. I don't know if there's any legal precedent. I mean, you may not know the answer to this, but has there ever been a case where they couldn't find enough people to form a jury?
I don't know, but I can speculate that it's going to be really difficult in Manhattan. Same thing in Washington, D.C. So if this case was anywhere else, he'd be fine, or anywhere but San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Washington. But also, it just shows you how obscene the case is, that they have to do it in New York. Even the predecessor of Alvin Bragg, Cyrus Vance Jr., chose not to prosecute. Yeah. This case is really a stretch, and even Alvin Bragg didn't want to do it, and was pressured by the sort of woke progressive cult in the New York DA's office.
Right. I mean, it says here that jury selection could take up to a fortnight. I mean, how does this affect his ability to campaign? I mean, one of the things that's fortunate, I guess, for him, I understand this is true, is that as long as he's campaigning to be president, all of his legal fees are payable by the campaign contributions that are made to him. So he doesn't have to worry about how much it's going to cost.
That's right. And you could make a pretty good argument for that.
Yeah.
The only reason he's being indicted and accused of these crimes, or supposed crimes, is because he's running for president.
Right.
So it truly is a campaign expense, if you want to argue that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that everyone who donates to the campaign wants it going to lawyers, but the fact is, if he wasn't running for president, these cases would not exist.
You could also argue, I suppose, that him sitting in a courtroom on camera, on television every single day is perhaps the best campaign he could ever have.
And he's already turned it into a campaign. You know, on one hand, they're keeping him from campaigning by keeping him in the courtroom, but on the other hand, today was a great campaign event for him. And remember, this is the ultimate election interference. All the alleged crimes occurred 8 years ago. They didn't think to indict him on any of this stuff until he declared he was running again. So that's what's important to keep in mind. And same with the other 3 indictments. You know, no one was bothering with any of this.
And also listening.
And then when he announced he was running, they
and listening to various opinions on all of this, I mean, it seems to come down to most people's view that, okay, even if he did do what they're alleging that he did, it's not actually illegal.
No.
So how is it a crime?
It's not a crime. In fact, falsifying business records in the state of New York is a misdemeanor, okay? It's like speeding ticket. Okay, you shouldn't do it, but it's not a big deal. They turned that into a felony. And so the felony had 5 years of statute of limitations, and then they extended it 1 year because of the COVID lockdown. So it really is a stretch. And making it a felony, that in itself was a real stretch because it's just not. And by the way, it's coming from Alvin Bragg, who's famous for reducing felony crimes from violent criminals to misdemeanors. So you could have an armed robbery, and now it's a misdemeanor, and you pay $100.
And interestingly, we're reminded more than ever, of course, about what Trump's presidency was like, because during the time when Trump was in, and he opted out of that ridiculous agreement with Iran that Barack Obama started, Iran was not in a position to do what they've just done. And they would never have done it. And people are now saying that many of the weapons that they have used were funded by Joe Biden when he released all of the funds to them.
They really are. And so by stopping the enforcement of the embargo on Iran, they went from 1 million barrels a day to 4 million barrels a day. That's turned into $60 billion. And by the way, Biden, of course, attacked the U.S. energy sector, which elevated oil prices, He cut back on production and made it really difficult for the U.S. to produce. So, you know, the U.S. had become the swing price for oil. So not only did he enable the Iranians, the mullahs, to sell more oil, 1 million to 4 million barrels a day, but he also elevated the prices. Who did that benefit? The mullahs, Putin, and Venezuela. And at the expense of the American taxpayer, the American voter, as well as the rest of the world, like the UK and the rest of Europe, that has to pay more for energy. It's
and
crazy.
I've read some great stuff over the last couple of days as well, particularly in the US, about how that whole kind of idea of Barack Obama's to firstly agree to give them credit as the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think he was the first American president to call them by that particular name. Gave them kind of, you know, succor and comfort, gave them encouragement to join the world kind of view of everything. And of course, they're never going to do that. So all of this stems all the way back to Barack Obama, doesn't it?
It really does. And the JCPOA was a complete disaster. We could thank Obama and John Kerry for that. They didn't even bring it to the Senate. So it was never an actual treaty signed by the U.S. because the Senate would never have gone for that. So this was a disaster. Trump backed away from it on day one and dropped out of the JCPOA. Biden, of course, day one, tried to get back into it, started appeasing the Iranians, appeasing the mullahs. He took the Houthis off the terrorist list.
And now look where we are.
He stopped Keystone Pipeline in America, but he flipped the switch back on for Nord Stream 2. He made all these really disastrous mistakes that had a great effect on geopolitics.
And effectively destabilized the Middle East because it gave Iran kind of proxy permission to continue to fund Hamas and Hezbollah, who, as I was saying earlier to our war correspondent over there in the Middle East, have been firing weapons into Israel ever since.
That's right.
You know, it's not just this weekend.
And so the United States is now funding both sides of the conflict in Israel because we're essentially funding, or Biden is funding Iran and the mullahs. He's also funding indirectly the Russians by elevating oil prices. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, went to Moscow before the Ukraine invasion and begged Putin to pump more oil to bring prices down. I mean, it's just obscene. And now Iran is sending drones to Russia that are indirectly funded by the United States.
And do you think any of that sort of foreign policy stuff will play into the election in November?
Absolutely, Mike. It's foreign policy doesn't typically rank in terms of voter issues. This year it does. Every 20 years or so, in '84 with Reagan and the Cold War,
Yes.
2004 with George W., in spite of his mistakes, foreign policy was a big deal in 2004. It was right after 9/11.
Right.
So every 20 years or so it happens. It's happening this year. It's gone from 20% to 40% in terms of how it ranks as a top issue.
Right.
The border is number one.
Right.
Inflation is number two. And foreign policy is number three. All those problems were caused by Joe Biden. So this isn't Jimmy Carter who inherited a lot of bad stuff. He inherited inflation for sure. I'm not sure you can blame Jimmy Carter for the things that happened with the Russians invading Afghanistan or the Islamic Revolution in Iran. But Biden has caused all these things. To compare him to Jimmy Carter, I think, is an insult to Jimmy Carter.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Biden is still, I think,
disaster.
going to be one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States of America. Greg Swenson from Republicans.
Good to be here,
Thank
Mike.
you very
Thanks.
much.